Hello everyone, and welcome to a new episode of the Geopolitical Pickup. My name is Juan Francisco Muñoz, and I'm as always joined by my colleague Ronan Wordsworth. How are you, Ronan?
I'm doing all right, thank you. How are you doing?
It's March in the Czech Republic. Spring arrived. It was 1 week of sun, and then we're back to the clouds. Although I must say, I was back home, and every time I go back home, I'm like, this is Spain. It's gonna be sunny. It's gonna be great. The day before going home, it was sunny here in Prague. The day that I went home, it was sunny here in Prague. You know what has March been? The rainiest March in the history of records in Spain. Like, really. I went to see the sun, and it was raining for 10 days in a row, and it's still raining. I don't know what I do. I don't know.
We're coming into summer here. It's lovely at the moment.
I need to see the sun, man. It's just like, and maybe it would also make the news better because, like, I just check the news and I'm getting more and more depressed. I don't know what's going. Well, I know what's going on.
I mean, part of that will flow into today's discussion, especially since we're talking about the sudden emergence in Europe of rearming and basically, I would say, the defense industry coming to life again after a period of semi-stagnation. Basically, the industrial capabilities within Europe have been very low for a long time, and this sudden explosion. And we'll go into a bit of the background potentially, and then.
But first, if you let me remind our listeners that they can subscribe to the Pickle Gazette newsletter. We've been publishing there bi-weekly articles explaining different concepts of geopolitics and merging them with current state of affairs. You can join on Substack, and you can also subscribe for your newsletter for the newsletter to arrive in your email. It's the Pickle Gazette from the Geopolitical Pickle. In Substack, you have the links in our description and everywhere.
Absolutely. And once again, we'll say it is free to subscribe. It will prompt you with a box there if you want to become a paid subscriber, but there's absolutely zero pressure to do so.
Although if you want to, I mean, who are we to tell you not to subscribe? It's it's good quality.
It helps us to continue to produce high quality content, I would say. But again, absolutely not a necessary part of that. So definitely good point. And you can find, especially we've talked about now the different domains of geopolitics and their contemporary relevance, as well as their historical part of evolution of geopolitics. So it's great resource out there for everyone.
For example, do you want to understand why is the U.S. really invested in Panama or Greenland? Well, there is an explanation there with a little bit of the theoretical background on why sea power is important and how...
especially to the U.S.
Especially to the U.S., exactly. Or, for example, you can see how is air power important and how it developed in the 20th century. Or what's the great power competition? In the end, it's explanations for you to understand better the world around you. And with this said, Ronan, I think we can get to today's topic. The EU is rearming itself.
Exactly. And I think to understand this, we have to look at a bit of the history of European defense. And if we think back to the early days of NATO, and since the early inception of NATO, US has been the leader of NATO by their own want and desire, basically. And what this did was enable the US arms industry to become this massive supplier of European weaponry and this kind of dependency link between Europe and the US at the request of the US. And so they were very happy in their position as like this hegemonic power within NATO, which enabled the US defense industrial base to become such an integral part of their economy. We see, I know people have probably heard of the US military industrial complex, but these companies wouldn't be able to fund all the R&D, all the production they do without getting external income, particularly from Europe, but also from other allies such as the UK, Australia, Japan, etc. But Europe was an integral part of that, and that was a very convenient makeup for the US. And that's a historical kind of position which led us to this declined industrial base within Europe. Do you want to run through now what has happened to kind of shake that up?
I mean, what has happened, two main aspects. First of all, the Russian aggression to Ukraine. definitely triggered the warnings in Europe, basically, not just in the European Union, because in this case we can also count on the UK, for example, even in Turkey, as in building up their military expenditure. But even in 2022, 2023, although there was an increase in expenditure in European soil, there was no such a sense of urgency.
I would say that was a period of rhetoric between European leaders about the need for increased defense capabilities and industrial production here.
But there was already an increase. For example, since in 2022, the expenditure on the military expenditure in the European Union was somewhere around 240 billion, and it increased from 2021 in around 10%. Okay, since 2022, it's gone from 240 billion to 326 billion in 2024.
Yeah, around the 1/3, 33% increase in expenditure in 2 years, which is significant for sure. But I would say it was probably out of line with the threat that they perceived from the Russia-Ukraine conflict.
Exactly. And now, obviously, where there's been a major shift, which is Donald Trump and his crew are in the White House, and they keep on... apparently, they are in their way of shattering U.S. alliances all over the world, because it's not just a problem that they have with Europe, it's a problem that they have with Japan, it's a problem that even with South Korea or Taiwan, they're creating this issue.
With Canada, which we've talked about previously.
With Canada, actually, at least maybe we will accept Canada in the EU. Maybe we will touch on the understanding of what is a European country.
Even I know Australia is still a very close US ally, but there is questions being raised even in Canberra about this future relationship and whether we should be so closely tied to the US when there is this potential for isolationism coming from the White House, depending on who is in there. And I think it's kind of really telling just from the leaked signal chats, which occurred very recently. And what was really interesting from there, one was the importance of naval power and especially in the US strategic thinking, but secondarily was kind of this disdain which Vice President J.D. Vance has for European allies. And I think this is kind of underpinning the way that they're treating allies. This idea that they're getting taken advantage of, which doesn't really make any sense or hold water. As we said, the US has been the greatest beneficiary of the status quo. I think it's a fundamental misunderstanding of how the system has worked. But him saying that only 3% of US trade goes through the Red Sea, whereas 40% of Europe's trade goes through there, so they should be paying for the attacks on the Houthis. Again, completely misguided in my opinion, but that really gives an insight into the way that the US current administration is thinking, and which has brought about this current urgent realization in Europe that they have to wake up and become somewhat independent from the US in their capabilities of developing defensive arms industries.
So let's get a little bit into the data. We will get into the current proposal by the Commission a little bit later, but first I want to go through the development that were happening during 2023-2024. First of all, I think it's important to highlight that Poland became the largest military in NATO after the United States by number of soldiers in active duty. This was a massive ramp up. They increased their percentage of GDP dedicated to military by they put it in 4.2 currently, and they're aiming at 5%.
And I would say this really highlights Poland's response, highlights the clear and present threat that they felt from Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Obviously, they were previously occupied part of the Soviet Union, and they have this institutional memory, and this is why they immediately ramped up defense expenditure massively, while other countries maybe dragged their heels.
Yes, I mean, basically, the smaller countries or countries that are farther from the Russia-Ukraine front, they definitely didn't increase their capacities, their expenditure as much as did the Poles. However, there's been a steady increase since in the last 10 years of at least 60% in all EU countries in defense. In these last couple of years, we can definitely highlight Poland, as we've already said. We can highlight Germany, which, although still the percentage of their GDP was below 2%, in 2024 it already reached this 2%.
And we'll definitely go back to Germany a bit later, especially around the recent changes following the election of Friedrich Merz to the chancellorship in February.
Exactly. Then, obviously, the countries that are most that fear the threat of the Russian invasion more closely, such as the Baltic states or Finland, are countries that they've definitely ramped up their military expenditure. And I want to explain a little bit what was the framework, because all this expenditure that we're talking about for now is individually in the countries. There is no common understanding of defense policy, common understanding in the European Union. Until now, what there was, and still is the European Defense Agency, which was established in 2004. But it was an agency created basically for the coordination among member states. Yes, it did aim to improve the defense capabilities through collaborative projects and research and collaboratory procurement, but it never really become something major within the European Union, because obviously, as we can understand, the European Union is a union where little by little states are giving in more sovereignty to Brussels, and this process takes time.
And defense was kind of the last pillar of that, I would say.
Yeah, defense.
It's still very much within individual countries' remit to do the defense, their own defense. There's no unified European army or anything like that.
There's no unified foreign policy in the EU.
Exactly.
Even, for example, if we take ourselves away from Europe for a second and we go to the Sahel, where France had interest there, and France brought other countries of the EU to help them in the interest there. This was not a EU project. It was France-led project where EU countries bandwagon because, well, okay, we need to help you because we are allies, blah, blah, blah. But as soon as France was kicked out of the Sahel, no other state remained in the Sahel in the form that they were doing when France was the umbrella under they were all. So, yeah, it's definitely not, there is no common policy in this sense. The budget for 2024 of the European Defense Agency was 48 billion euros, which is pretty small, and we'll talk about numbers later. And just to have a glimpse of how this has changed, in 2024, the EU, quote-unquote, took steps to enhance its defense capabilities with how much? 300 million euros for common defense buying for the first time. 300 million euros. If I'm not wrong, an F-35 is 35 million bucks, which means that you can have less than 10 F-35s. Obviously, this money was mostly, well, not obviously, but this money was mostly used for collaborative projects and for ammunition, for bulk buying of ammunition. But then again, it shows the importance to this common framework that was given within the European Union until now,
which was very little. As we can see, it's basically, I think, again, this was what was happening in the wake of the invasion of Russia into Ukraine, and the rhetoric around it was, we need to do something, but there was very little action. If you're only committing $300 million from member states to this European defense capability enhancement, you're really not showing a great will. And we can see exactly what we'll go into the numbers later, how that has rapidly shifted in the last 2 months, I would say.
Yeah. So what has happened in the last 2 months? Again, well, from the Trump administration, there's been clear messages towards its European allies, negative messages. I cannot really recall a single positive one. Maybe Poland received a positive quote from Donald Trump saying that they were spending money and they were doing good with their military. But even the Baltic states, for example, which is countries that they spend more than 2% of their GDP in defense, as it's established by the NATO treaty, Not even they, apparently. Well, I mean, there is a question whether Donald Trump knows where the Baltic states are or not, but definitely, he in this meeting in the White House, he did mention that Poland was a good ally and that, okay, probably the Americans were gonna keep their troops there. But when asked about the Baltics, I think the answer was, we will see.
But also, I mean, we've heard from other members of the administration the potential to withdraw all U.S. troops from Europe, which, again, doesn't really make sense from a strategic point of view for the U.S. However, when you're getting this messaging coming out of the Pentagon, you have to take note. And I mean, another kind of indicator of this is what he said recently at the announcement of his new F-47 fighter jet, which is still kind of pie in the sky stuff, I would say. But what he said there was like, he had European allies calling him constantly about this new aircraft, which doesn't exist yet, but that the US would probably supply certain allies, perhaps toned down versions of the plane. And this also raised questions about the F-35s, the current ones that are in production, and there's large backlog of orders for European countries of these fifth generation fighters. Whether the US had the capability to basically shut them down with a kill switch. This was what came out in rumors, and Lockheed Martin was very quick trying to shut down any of these rumors about a kill switch, but it really undermines the veracity, the use case for having these really advanced, expensive fighters coming from someone that is apparently seeing you not as an ally anymore and could potentially shut your equipment down if they want to. And this is kind of a massive policy shift from the US. It's all been driven specifically from the White House, but it's kind of given this sudden realization, what if the US is not our friend? What if we're in combat with US and we're so reliant on them for our own defense capabilities?
What if suddenly we see a hybrid intervention in Greenland?
Exactly.
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, clearly what's boosting this is the perception of the US as not being your ally anymore, at least during this administration. However, the effects that this will have will be long-lasting, regardless of whether the administration changes in the following election or not, because once you're in the path for rearmament, once you're in the path for looking for this strategic independence from the US, clearly coming back to trust when there is the possibility of an unreliable US ally.
Precisely. I mean, if we just take that word trust, right? I think this is 5 decades worth of work that the US has done to build this trust with European allies, which has been undone in 3 months, basically, since Trump's inauguration.
It's amazing, eh? I didn't know that you could do it that fast.
Because, as you said, if next time it's a Democratic win in the White House, the thought is still there that it doesn't matter if they're friends now, it can all change so suddenly depending on the next election. And this is why the long-term lasting damage is going to be significant, I think, to the US arms industry and this reputational damage to their standing amongst allies. The way they're treating Canada, I mean, you can see that the hatred towards the US coming from Canada. And I mean, the miraculous turnaround in fortunes for the Canadian Liberal Party. Basically were predicted to
lose the election
in a landslide, and now it's very, very close in polls. Most polls have them even potentially in front, specifically because of what Trump's doing to Canada. Mm-hmm. So I think this is really underlines,
because the Liberals in the end, although they were criticized a little bit, well, they were criticized from all sides for not taking a stronger stance against Trump, for taking a too strong stance, for being like they still need to appease the Trump administration in a way. I mean, in the end, you can see that Canada hit back with the sanctions. With sanctions, with the tariffs. And yeah, I mean, this was unexpected 4 months ago. I mean,
and like just to highlight that the change in Canadian defense policy, which is going to affect US economy, basically a week or two ago, Canada signed a new contract with Australia to jointly develop military radar systems for the Arctic region, worth in the order of $6 billion, which is Australia's largest ever defense contract export. And this was always going to go to a US company until this kind of posturing by the US. So, I mean, this is why it never really made sense, this posture towards allies, because you're shooting yourself in the foot. But we've seen that doesn't necessarily hold the Trump administration back. And so we can already see in Canada that contract has already been signed now with Australia. I mean, much to our benefit as Australians, but the same thing is going to play out here with Europe. And we'll go through in a moment the expenditure, but we can see this in defense stocks in Europe. They've all gone exceptionally higher, but also in Japan and South Korea. If we look at those two countries, which have become big arms exporters as well, their major defense industry stocks have all gone through the roof.
The South Korean have gone 150%.
Around 150% since the start of the year, and Japan around 70%. So we're talking like massive increases in these defense industry stock prices as a direct result of Trump's actions.
So let's see, what is Europe planning now? Given this context, there was a plan. Let's be clear. There's nothing clear until now. There's several proposals. We are seeing a trend, but this is not clear. What do we know for now? For now, we know that the European Commission came with a plan that was European Defence Readiness 2030, that they called it Rearm Europe, which was a name that was not liked by many countries because...
In classic Brussels fashion, they had to backtrack on the name and change the name within a few days of coming out with Rearm Europe. Now it's called Readiness 2030.
It's called Readiness 2030, and the concept about it is to prioritize purchases to EU companies to update critical infrastructure, especially, for example, common rail systems. This is basically aimed at military mobility within the European Union, because right now, estimates say that a brigade would take around a week to 2 weeks to get from Germany to the Baltics, which is nonsensical given that there is no border in between.
Mm-hmm.
So it would be infrastructure in rails, in roads, and in order to better connect the Union. And then also training and interoperability, in which Ukraine is included, because there's already Ukrainian troops, special ops and so on, that have been trained in the EU or in the UK. Apart from this, well, this is the aim. The proposal from the Commission comes in two ways. First, it is SAFE instrument, which is up to 150 billion euros in European Union-backed loans to promote this and common procurement. There is the understanding that if the European Union countries would buy in bulk together, the prices would be cheaper and it would be basically more efficient, because also you would be buying the same product for everyone. So it would be standardized among the EU countries. Then there is another proposal of a coordinated escape clause for EU fiscal rules. The EU is really tough, or has always tried to be really tough in fiscal rules. Countries could not surpass a certain percentage of debt over their GDP. Although, I mean, 2008 economic crisis.
But that caused even stricter controls following the Eurozone crisis.
Yeah, but many states, for example, went over the 100%, which, for example, to access the European Union, I think it used to be about 60% of debt on your GDP. Then they increased it to 80. There's always been this debt in the European Union has always been the topic until war has happened, basically. So this coordinated escape clause for EU fiscal rule will allow members to exceed deficit limits to fund defense investments of over 800 billion euros in 4 years. To this, we can add that Germany alone has already changed its constitution. Germany has a really strict policy towards debt in itself. That's why also the EU has such a strict...
I mean, if we look at that, so it was called the German debt brake unofficially, but basically they couldn't exceed debt limits within their government spending. And basically, as soon as Friedrich Merz came in as Chancellor, he said that they wanted to, as a high priority, change the law and the constitution there to allow the government to spend more specifically on defense and construction. And we've seen that pass through the parliament really rapidly with, I think, almost over two-thirds of the votes.
Yeah, because both right now the German parliament is still not composed, but the conservatives have already won. So
I think there was a kind of a fear that both AfD, the far right party, and the far left Socialist Party both oppose the proposal, and so it would have been more difficult if they didn't push it through now before the inception of the new parliament.
Exactly. Germany alone with this change in the constitution will have up to 500 billion euros that will not be considered within the debt of the state, which is a lot of money.
500 billion for infrastructure and 500 billion for defense industry as well. So it's $1 trillion that they can spend over the next 5 years, I believe.
Yeah, also because all of these budgets, again, the German one is already happening. This is a change in their constitution. However, in the European Union, it's still in proposals, and there's a lot of push for the production of
dual-use technologies
that can be used for civilian and military purposes,
which includes drones, which includes AI and other things like this, and satellites. So, I mean, that's always been the European attitude towards space. For instance, you want satellites that you can use both for civilian purposes, but also for military purposes if needed.
And also, this includes the ammunition plan 2.0. If we remember since the war in Ukraine started, the Europeans have been providing with ammunition to Ukraine, and in 2023, they aim to provide 1 million rounds of 1 million shells by 2024, to which they managed to provide 500,000. So there is the aim to make 2 million shells annually to supply, to be able to supply Ukraine, but also to restock and stockpile within the European stocks, because there is no long-term strategic reserves at this point. And in order to, if you want to have if you're thinking about a war as the one that is happening in Ukraine right now, which was completely off the map 4 years ago, a long-lasting state-to-state war, clearly you need to have this.
And what's important with this is like the time that it takes to set up factories that are capable of producing these ammunition and artillery shells and other defense industry components does not happen overnight. You need to retool your whole workshop and manufacturing capabilities. And so you have to move away from other types of manufacturing or develop new industries altogether and be able to get the population trained to be able to do that and all these other things, which, again, doesn't happen overnight. So this has to start now if they want to be ready in 3 or 4 years' time, basically, to be producing this.
And probably if a large-scale conflict comes in 3 years, it will still be too late now, but there is still the need or the perception that something has to be done.
I think also if we look at Russian economy, for instance, they've become that wartime economy, and so many resources have been directed towards these manufacturing facilities for defense industry and this military industrial complex. And that means that they're able to outproduce all of Europe put together easily. And that's going to continue for a long time, even with this current proposal. So this is why I think that the understanding within Brussels thinking is suddenly like, we need to do something now, even though for 3 years they've been like, yeah, we need to do something. It's suddenly become extremely urgent.
Yeah, and I mean, if we see then just the sheer numbers of what can Russia produce, as you were mentioning, at this point, they can produce more than what the European Union can produce combined. However, still, we can't forget that Russia is 140 million people with an economy that is based on extraction of resources. That, yes, they changed to wartime economy. And this is also a perception by the Europeans. Even if a peace is signed between Russia and Ukraine in the current conditions that the U.S. is proposing, what is perceived from Brussels is that Russia will not stop stockpiling, will not stop growing its military complex, because at this point you've shifted your economy to a wartime economy, and it's, first of all, it's not that easy to decouple from that. Second, if not for the wartime economy, probably Russia will go bankrupt.
Absolutely. I think they really can't scale back at the moment. Already the economy is kind of overheating because of this production, defense industrial production. And again, yeah, as you said, if they were to scale that back, you'd have massive unemployment, you'd go into deep recession, and the central government economy would collapse. So I think they are going to keep stockpiling regardless of what happens. And this is basically Ukraine's argument as well. Without any sort of security guarantees for them, all that we're doing is giving Russia time to rearm and get ready for a new wave of assault.
Let's talk just a little bit. I want to touch on the number of soldiers because we've talked about equipment. There's also a push from the European Union and from member states to enlarge their numbers in their militaries. Not every member state is happy with this, though. Not every member state is on board. But the most eastwards you go, the more on board they are with this, obviously. And just to put it in numbers, there's an estimate of 600,000 Russian troops in Ukraine. There's an estimate of 1.5 million Russian soldiers active. And there is the plan by the Russian government to aim to 2.5 million soldiers. This highly overruns the amount of soldiers that there are in active duty in Europe. Just to make a note, without conscription, there is around 100,000 soldiers in France, and that's the largest. Conscription included, Poland is the largest military with 215,000 soldiers. If combined, the number of the European soldiers is not that far off from the Russians, but still it's combined. Most of the troops are not trained, and the interoperability of them is in question because, for example, you have 27 languages. And although English can be a conductive language, the level of English in many countries of their military is not the best. And we've actually talked with several people from different states here that they don't really trust their military's English level. And I want to also mention that I want to go back a little bit in the US and NATO in itself. And this is a little bit more on your perception, Ronan, because if the US is not a reliable ally and is the main sponsor of NATO, then what is the purpose of NATO going forward? Or what is going to be the role of NATO going forward? Because, there's some people in Europe that say, look, we always needed to ramp up our expenditure. Many countries are under the 2% agreed of expenditure of GDP. But at the same time, NATO is the umbrella that the United States created actively to combat Russia. If we go to a world where the United States and Russia are more aligned than the United States with Europe, then what do we do in NATO?
I mean, that's a great question. I think for Europe, NATO's significance is going to be severely diminished. Same for the Canadians. I think what is important is the Middle East posture for NATO, especially regarding Turkey. I mean, Turkey obviously a very large, important member of NATO. And I think for Europe, they want to keep Turkey close and kind of in their orbit. Obviously, Turkey has their own problems at the moment internally. But I think NATO will be seen as a tool to keep Turkey closely tied to Europe. But when Donald Trump is questioning whether the US would respond to an Article 5 attack, then I guess you can say that NATO isn't necessarily worth what it was before. It is important to note that the EU is still very much rhetorically saying that all these moves are not anti-US. They're just basically in line with their NATO commitments to paying their fair share in defense spending and all of these other statements. However, there is no denying, as I think we've outlined now, that this is a direct response to Trump administration, basically a wake-up call to Europe that they might not be the best ally that they once thought that they were, and that the European Union needs to wake up themselves to become self-reliant. And so in that instance, I think if we look within Europe, there was a new study released just last week. And this basically said that European Union unity is at an all-time high. This was a survey which is taken twice annually since 1983, and I believe it was 74% of all respondents of the 30,000 people said that their country was better off in NATO. 89% of the respondents said that more European unity was needed in the face of current geopolitical challenges. And so this really underlines this. I could see the war, and many different geopolitical analysts have seen it in two possible outcomes for Europe. One, divide further, kind of become more a fractured situation, which we've seen these cracks appearing ever since, obviously, pre-Brexit. But Brexit was basically the highlight of that, and other European countries asking for a change in the EU and more divisions between, more independence for the states. That was one camp. I personally was in the latter camp, which is that this really could be a trigger to bring about more European unity. And you can see the appetite there just based off these recent survey results. Basically, there was, as I said, 30,000 respondents from all EU countries across January and February. And the desire is there then for Europe to become its own defense capable force, separate from NATO, which was never really a thing before. Even though the European Union has some common defense clause and stuff like this, that was all under NATO umbrella. It was not really a serious consideration within the EU. And so I think that is likely, to me, what's going to happen, this increase in European defense capabilities, which has been severely lacking since the EU's inception. It was not designed around this originally, but as we've seen the European economies and countries come closer together in the economic and political spheres, we haven't really seen the same in the military sphere until now. And I think that is what we are likely to see, and less reliance on NATO, potentially bilateral partnerships with UK, with Canada, with other allies, but some sort of self-reliance here within Europe.
And I'd say even with the nuclear deterrence, for example, because economically speaking, the European Union can face Russia. Economically and militarily speaking, let's be clear. Okay, we need to increase the capabilities. We need to increase interoperability. Russia has struggled for 3 years now to conquer 1/5 of Ukraine.
Exactly.
That was a country that had basically an extremely corrupt military at the beginning of the war with zero military training.
This is part of the argument about why the US posture doesn't really matter, because Russia is not capable of doing anything and they have no interest. And I think that's definitely some arguments on that side within Europe. But if we look at the eastern flank, they're much more.
I mean, they clearly, obviously, this only works if you are able to defend your weakest link, which in this case would be the Baltic states.
Exactly.
Basically, because Poland can probably defend itself, Finland can probably defend itself. Now, the Baltic states have a combined population of 10 million people, basically.
They have Belarus, Kaliningrad, and Russia on all sides.
Exactly. They're completely surrounded, so clearly that is the problem. And in nuclear deterrence, in my opinion, because all the EU countries, basically, except for France and the UK, like they are free of nuclear weapons, unless it's nuclear weapons from the US.
They've always existed under the US nuclear umbrella.
If these were to disappear, then I'd assume in my opinion, the logical way out for the EU without relinquishing this non-proliferation of nuclear weapons would be putting your money in the UK and France and allowing them to develop more, to create an umbrella that substitutes the American umbrella.
Which the French have displayed a willingness to do already.
It is a little bit complicated, though, because the French will have elections in 2 years, if everything goes as it's supposed to be, and this is not something really completely shared among the French political spectrum. So we will see, but definitely that's something important. And I just want to mention one last thing before we finish with this topic. That is, where is this money going to come from? And there is a lot of questioning within the European Union, within the member states themselves. Where is the military spending going to come from? And many are aiming at the social welfare. And in my opinion, this is something that is completely wrong. Because at this point, in this multipolarity that we are heading to, we need to pick our side, and our side is also what makes us be ourselves. And the social welfare in the European Union is what makes the European Union be. This is what makes populations want to enter the European Union and force the states to enter the European Union. This is what, if you ask Europeans, what has the European Union given you? Although obviously there is a lot of anger and resentment towards the EU, as to any supranational government or even your national government. In my opinion, this social welfare is what makes Europe different, because it doesn't exist anywhere else in the world, and because it really guarantees that, for example, in comparison with the United States, the US has much larger GDP per capita, without a doubt, but their people, but they have higher levels of poverty, for example, inequality is higher, and so on. If, as Europeans, we allow social welfare to be eaten by the defense expenditure, we will be downhill, in my opinion, for the medium and long run, because we come from societies that have been militarized before. We come from societies that may not even be that happy or that safe. They may not even feel that safe with their own military. And if we buy in destroying our social welfare to invest in military, we would be giving in to what I think actors like Russia and the US, the current US administration, want. They want a European Union that is at odds with its own population, so that it's weak. And I think that would be key, not to give in to these two, because militarily it would be really difficult to be defeated, but socially
and values-wise, I think
values-wise, it's not that difficult to corrupt from inside and to, in the end, make our countries be weaker, basically.
I think that's a great place to leave it for today, because I think that was a wide-ranging and interesting discussion around EU defense expenditure. And I hope that you guys can take something from that and learn something, maybe get a new perspective on what is happening, a better understanding.
And share your thoughts, because this is a really big topic.
And a very much evolving topic. As we speak, there's different news coming out every day, basically, as this topic becomes more and more relevant, and this rapid shifts in posture. So yeah,
we'll see you next time. So in the next episode of the Geopolitical People.
Cheers for now. Bye.
Bye. The Geopolitical Pickle is created by Ronan Wordsworth and Juan Francisco Muñoz. Follow us on Instagram at The Geopolitical Pickle or Twitter at The Geopickle for more content, and follow us on every podcast platform.